we are going to do a dive into China's sort of nuclear bomb that they dropped last week with respect to rare earths. This is something that we have been writing and warning about for many years. We said that we thought China's move was tantamount to declaring a nuclear economic war on the US, and that we thought that China has a total escalation dominance in this scuffle, and that the US would undoubtedly have to beat at least a temporary retreat, and that we predicted that China would win what we frame as an important battle in World War III.
Before we dive in, a quick whisper about today's sponsor, Ghost Founder. You know that moment when an idea jumps from someday to why not today? Ghost Founder lives in that moment. Ghost Founder takes the sketch from your napkin, gives it a heartbeat, and walks it out into the world. Fast. While everyone else is still writing pitch decks, the ghosts are wiring prototypes, lining up seed investors, and tuning your ops. Product market fit isn't just a hope, it's an outcome. If you're the kind of renegade who refuses to wait for permission, visit ghostfounder.com. Because around here, we scope things, build things, and fund things, in that order. Ghost Founder, the quiet engine behind loud breakthroughs.
Today's guest is one of the most fascinating voices in finance and energy, the anonymous collective known as Doomberg. If you've never heard of them, think of a green, sharp chicken that writes some of the most lucid, contrarian takes on markets, geopolitics, and energy anywhere, and they publish it independently on Substack. They've built one of the largest paid audiences in the space, or I think actually on Substack, by asking simple questions. What if the mainstream story is exactly backwards, for example? We both found out about Doomberg via Grant Williams' show, and this was either right at the start or just after the start of COVID. And I've been a very happy paying subscriber for a while now. And I not only enjoy the content of the stories that Doomberg breaks, but also the writing itself. It just often feels to me like this is what journalism should feel like, should be like to read. And today we're going to explore whether, of course, the trademark Doom might be, we fully understand, appreciate that there's a lot of doom in this current situation that the West is facing. But what if behind the doom, there's actually also renewal that we can seek out and take advantage of? So with all that, thank you so much, Doomberg, for taking the time and joining us on the covered call.
Yeah, great to be here with both of you. We're very much looking forward to a great conversation.
Yeah, same. Doomberg, really appreciate the chance to speak with you. So I just want you to know my parents are going to be so proud that I'm fulfilling a personal milestone by finally being able to record an episode with the green chicken himself.
I hope we make your parents proud. What can I say?
Yeah. So just to get the ball rolling, right? When you wake up, let's say these last few days, and the sun's shining through the chicken coop, what has been on your mind? Like, what's been on your radar to drill deeper as you see the headlines that we're all seeing right now at the midpoint of October 2025?
Yeah, you bet. That's a pretty easy question for me to answer, because since we have to research, write, edit, publish, promote, and defend a piece every four to 5 days, whatever's on my mind happens to be the piece that I'm working on at the moment, which probably won't come as much of a surprise to you guys, but we are going to do a dive into China's sort of nuclear bomb that they dropped last week with respect to rare earths. This is something that we have been writing and warning about for many years. And we think we put out a piece, we put out a post on Substack Notes, which is, you can think of it as a more polite version of what old Twitter used to be. We said that we thought China's move was tantamount to declaring a nuclear economic war on the US, and that we thought that China has total escalation dominance in this scuffle, and that the US would undoubtedly have to beat at least a temporary retreat, and that we predicted that China would win what we frame as an important battle in World War III, which longtime Doomberg subscribers will know that we think World War III started with the Crimea War, or the occupation of Crimea by Russia, and the subsequent sanctions campaign that were levied against Russia, and then Russia's decision to dump U.S. treasuries and to buy gold. We think that's when the Third World War started, and all of the news that has sort of unfolded since then can be viewed through that lens, the war in Ukraine being an important battle of World War III, and the economic war between China and the United States is probably just as important as the war in Ukraine to historians when they look back at this period in the decades ahead. So we're going to lay out in the next piece why it is we believe those four things that we posted over the weekend, and so happy to take it in any of the directions that you guys would like to.
Yeah, so the last piece that's already published was the final countdown, right? And in that you were detailing that essentially NATO has lost the war against Russia in Ukraine already. Interesting for me, since I'm German, that this very direct follow-on effect of this might be the collapse of the European Union. Could you just explain a bit more how you see these two things kind of connecting?
Sure. Yeah, and those statements that you just made might sound controversial to people who are bathing in the propaganda of the day. So perhaps I should take a step back and explain how we come to those conclusions.
Yeah, please.
So first of all, yeah, we pride ourselves on lateral thinking. And as lateral thinkers, we develop what we call mental models. And we have little emotional attachment to the mental models. We use them until they stop working. And we don't even really need to understand why they work. We like to say that you need not understand, it just needs to work, right? And so a mental model we developed in early 2024, and we posted to our premium pro tier an entire Doom Zoom on it, was that the war in Ukraine was lost. And when we say that, what does that mean? It means that Ukraine can't win the war. Ukraine is not yet defeated, although it is getting close to being defeated. But the war was lost when the Ukrainian offensive of 2023 was defeated by Russia, which became apparent in December of 2023. And from that moment on, Russia has been fighting a grinding war of attrition, slowly marching, from east to west, which is something historically it knows how to do. And Russia traditionally fights wars of attrition, whereas we in the West tend to frame war, we measure war progress in acres, and Russia simply does not. And since Russia is vastly larger than Ukraine, and even the head of NATO admits that Russia is vastly outproducing the combined members of NATO in armory and other weapons, it is impossible for Ukraine to win a conventional war of attrition. And one of our big fears, which we articulated back in early 2024, is that losing wars is really hard, and a defeat against the combined efforts of NATO, which is exactly what this is. This is a war between Russia and the United States, funded by NATO and fought by Ukrainian soldiers mostly. There are, of course, soldiers from all over NATO in Ukraine, but predominantly the casualties have been suffered by Ukraine. Tragic casualty of this proxy war is what's happening to Ukraine, to its people, to its country. There's no war is awful. We are strongly anti-war, but nonetheless, you have to analyze the pieces on the board. So when we say the war is lost, that's what we mean. Russia continues to grind on. We think that Russia isn't really fighting at its full potential, but it is cranking up its industrial potential for sure. And this is something we argued in April of 2022. The sanctions war was always going to lose and backfire, and it has. And so the sanctions war has been lost, which actually is very closely related to the China question, because we believe this is the defeat of the US dollar-dominated Western financial system. Because Russia has proven that a country blessed with commodities and resources can insulate its economy from sanctions. So the sanctions war the West has been defeated in the sanctions war, and the military war is lost. And now, to answer your question, it is impossible in our view that the current suite of leaders of France, the UK, Germany, Poland, and the European Commission can survive the defeat to Russia. They've bet it all. And when you bet it all and you lose, there are significant consequences. Now, if we have that as a mental model, then the question becomes, are they going to go quietly? And the answer to that is a resounding no. We've seen what's happened in Romania, the efforts to get Viktor Orban out in Hungary, Macron's stubborn gripping on to power. It's almost become clown show at this point. Starmer, the least popular prime minister in history, and yet just powers on and is flying all over the world. All of these leaders spend an inordinate amount of time on Ukraine and nowhere near enough time on the domestic political needs of their constituents. And so we're seeing a digital crackdown, censorship crackdown, interfering in the elections of member states and non-member states, Moldova, for example, and the constant need to keep the war going, because once the war is lost, I think the consequences to the leaders who were involved in it will be severe. So that's why we think the EU, as it is known today, can persist, and then the situation in France could very well be a catalyst. If things get out of control there in the debt markets. So I know that was a bit of a long answer, but I felt, given the
No, it's good. Thank you.
shock some of your listeners might have at hearing such things, they required a proper explanation.
No, I appreciate it. Go ahead, Jay.
No, do me. I just wanted to ask, just for the listeners, right? Why would this whole apparatus, this whole power structure, put everything on the line for what's happening in Ukraine? Could you help to contextualize it a little bit? Why is Ukraine such a big deal that they're going basically all in on what's happening there?
It's a bit of a mystery. So I could tell you that I live in flyover country in the United States of America. And if I did a poll of 1,000 people in the county that I live in and said, do you care who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass? We might get 2 people who even know what I'm talking about. Europe, a different story, of course. Europe has a long history of continental wars, this being just the latest. My honest belief is that when the war started, these leaders were convinced they were going to win, that sanctions would destroy the Russian economy, that Russia is a paper tiger, as Trump famously, and I think quite stupidly posted on Truth Social, that they would win, that Putin would be toppled, and that they would splinter Russia into dozens of nations, and NATO would continue its march to the east, and then after that, they would turn their attention to China. I don't know why people feel the need to turn their attention to China, for example, but that's probably something we could talk about later. So once pot committed, then I think what you get is a gradual incrementalism of sunk cost fallacy.
Yeah, maybe.
Having committed so much prestige, treasure, blood, losing wars is hard, which is why you should try really hard not to get into them. And what we're seeing is the strong desire for the leaders of Europe to not recognize reality. I saw this week that that Ukraine, at the urging of NATO allies, is going to lower the age for recruiting soldiers. And it is what it is. It's sad, it's tragic, but this is what we believe is going on.
Yeah, if I can add a bit of color, just because Jason and I both are living in Germany at the moment, and just from just looking back, I remember in 2014, like the skirmish, so to speak, in Crimea, it didn't dominate the news as much. And I remember at the time having conversations with friends and family where they were like, we don't really care about Ukraine. Like that's the sentiment wasn't that it was a piece of Europe that we had to defend against Russia. It was much more distant. It was like, it's more like a local conflict, let them sort it out kind of an attitude. But this completely changed now in the second go around. And all of a sudden, everybody is like convinced that, if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he's going to come to Berlin next, which I'm like, it seems like there's a shorter route if that was the intention, right?
What could he possibly want with Berlin? No offense to Berliners.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is and so now you're not. I mean, you're not even allowed to really have the conversation, right? You must support unequivocally. You're committing wrongthink, basically.
You're not allowed, Doomberg, I'm not sure if you know, but in Germany, it's frowned upon to fly the German flag. But when I was traveling around different German cities a year or 2 ago, there were many house. It's like city halls, all flying the Ukrainian flag, right? Which was so weird for me to see.
Yeah, look, propaganda is very, very powerful. And when you saturate the field with propaganda, look, we study everybody's propaganda. This is also something that I would advise listeners to start doing. And a key reason why we think we have a higher hit rate in the accuracy of our geopolitical predictions. So we will read Russian propaganda. We will read Ukrainian propaganda. We read German propaganda. we read the British propaganda, we read Israeli propaganda, and we read Iranian propaganda, and we read Chinese propaganda, and we're living in the US, so we can't avoid American propaganda. It's a very fascinating exercise to read how the same event is told through the lens of 8 different propaganda outlets. Then we backfill that with sources that we have found over time to be relatively accurate and show their homework. And that's what we strive to do at Doomberg. So we try to understand what the truth is. We develop mental models that we then use for brainstorming. We lay out what those models are, the assumptions inherent in them. So for example, this weekend, the moment we saw Trump's Truth Social post on Friday and the markets tanked, we knew the taco trade was back on. Taco is Trump, always chickens out. That's what it's a Twitter meme. That's not something that we have created, to be clear.
Yeah, we know.
But what that actually says, this is an important point. In our mental model right now, the one that's working, the one that we used to successfully call the end of the Israel-Iran war, for example, is that Trump always assumes he has escalation dominance in any negotiation. And he simply doesn't in the military campaign against Russia, assuming he's not willing to use nuclear weapons. And heaven help us, let's hope that's true. And he does not have escalation dominance in the trade war with China. He has escalation dominance over France and over Britain and over the European Union and over South Korea and over Japan. There's a commonality of all those countries I've just named is the U.S. has military bases in those countries. Of course, they are vassals of the United States military. So he has escalation dominance there, and he could dictate trade terms and all of that stuff. He cannot do that with the Chinese, and he cannot do that with Putin. Just can't. As much as he tries, you'll note, summit, phone calls, browbeating, True Social posts, Putin is not given an inch on his demands for a solution that addresses the, quote, root cause of the problem, right? Root causes, I should say. So when we saw Trump's post, first of all, when we saw the Chinese nuclear weapon on Thursday, we were kind of blown away. And then we saw Trump's post, and we said, yeah, by that dip, he's going to have to pull back, and there's going to be a relief rally on Monday or Tuesday, which is what that post actually was implying. We don't give investment advice, and so we would never say that. But the taco trade is by the dip because Trump's going to back down. And so why does China have escalation dominance? Well, because, as we have been writing about for years, China has used financial and environmental weapons to accumulate monopoly positions in critical things that make the economy run. When the time came, as it did last week, when they'd had enough of Trump and his bullying tactics, they called his bluff. They said, okay. So, everyone thinks that the West has a lead in semiconductors, and temporarily it certainly does. But ASML relies on magnets that are rare earths from China. China could just tell ASML, the monopoly maker of ultra, the lithography machines that are at the core of TSMC's foundries that make the chips that NVIDIA designs. All of that is a stool resting on Chinese rare earths. They could just say, yeah, sorry, ASML, but you can't send those machines to Taiwan anymore, and nor can you send them to the US because we'll just stop sending you rare earths. So that's where we are. We think that these tactics will work, but only for a few years. And we could talk about the renewal later when we get to the renewal section of this podcast.
Yeah, so firsthand experience, right? So I have a small engineering company in Texas, and one of the projects we're working on is drone related, right? It's not military, nothing like that, but we do need some high powered motors, flight controllers and stuff, and all these things come from China. They're really the only ones that make them in high quality, for a good price, available in high volumes, etc. And there's actually been a complete ban of export from China, right? So not import into the US, but a global ban of drone and drone related parts already for several weeks that nobody somehow knows or talks about. I just found out because some parts we couldn't order anymore. And then I, went on WeChat, talked to the suppliers, and they said, no, sorry, not allowed. And I was like, can you send them to Europe? And they said, global ban. So there was already precursors to this, I think. So I wasn't too surprised, honestly, when the news broke of rare earths. To me, it was very much the logical next step. But it is the significance of it can't be overstated. So I think, calling it a nuclear bomb is a bit of a shocker, but it's in economic terms, it's probably accurate.
Well, look, if China decides it can shut down every automotive manufacturing plant in the West.
Yeah.
And it has the power to do so. And the West has nothing it can do in response. And it just threatened Trump with that. So it says, we have nuclear missiles, and if I press this button, goodbye to your economies. Now, The leaders of the West have done this to themselves. The piece, I think, that called this best that we wrote 2.5 years ago is called geopolitical warfare. Purposeful degradation of your environment to achieve geopolitical aims is what China has perfected. I was in heavy industry. I competed against China. One of the things that I think makes Doomberg popular is we bring the industrial lens to debates that are typically held between journalists and professors and government employees. Here's what China does. It sees a supply chain it would like to dominate. Let's say magnesium. The mining and smelting of magnesium is dirty business. And heavy industry, in the heavy commodities sector, cost is king. They're price takers. They're price-taking manufacturers. So they make what they make, and they have to accept the market price where the demand curves meet. And it's very difficult to compete on cost when your competitor's idea of a water treatment plant is a pipeline to the river. I've competed against such companies. They will crush you on cost. And so, because China was willing to degrade its environment in ways, if only temporarily, that the West would find intolerable, it put scores and scores of heavy industry out of business in the West, to the point where 98% of solar ingot manufacturing is done in China, and 90+% of rare earth processing is done in China. The hard part is not the mining of rare earths, it's the conversion of concentrate to pure metal. The US used to do that. It doesn't do it anymore. So even if you open up a rare earth mine in Germany, good luck getting it permitted, that today, that concentrate would have to be sent to China. And once it's in China, China can do what it likes with it. And so they have a national strategy. They're at least as capitalistic as the West, but they have a national strategy. And so we've seen this over and over again. They're dominating automotive manufacturing now. They're dominating batteries. These are strategic things. You could read the 5-year plan and say, okay, I need to sell my holdings in this category because we've seen this movie before. And so that's what China has done. And the expressed intent in the same documents was to prepare China, to insulate China from external pressure, which is code for United States hegemony. And now they must feel they have achieved that. An underreported element of last week is that China must feel very confident in its own internal abilities to make semiconductors and lithography machines more than the headlines are articulating.
Yeah, knowing how the Chinese operate, they probably would not have gone out on a limb like that unless they knew to a large extent a lot of their bases are covered, right?
It's very difficult to
I wanted to ask you if you had seen the news on the Netherlands taking action against Nexperia.
I did.
Any thoughts on what happened, or how do you see that event from your perspective?
How I see it is not as important as how the Chinese see it. And so I will describe the event and then I will predict what China will do. That event is in response to, I believe, I'm not in the room, they don't talk to me from what I read and what I can deduce. What actually started the latest flare-up in the trade war was the US Department of Commerce issued a new rule hours before the US government shut down. It's called the 50% rule. Are you guys familiar with this rule? The 50% rule vastly expanded the number of companies on what the US calls its entity list. This is the sanctioned list, the list of companies that the US is targeting. And this new clarification of that rule stated that any subsidiary of an entity list company that is at least 50% owned by either an entity list company or a combination of entity list companies, then that company is now on the entity list. So in other words, the company that you mentioned, because it is owned by presumably a Chinese company on the entity list, was now subject to sanctions, and they just took it over for that reason. And so using the new guidance of the Commerce Department, I believe is why the seizure of that company's shares and the firing of its board was done. The Chinese will characterize this as illegal theft, and there will be severe consequences. And I think, again, since China certainly has escalation dominance over the Netherlands economically, which of course is the home of ASML, we expect retribution to be swift and severe. And then we'll see. I'm reminded of like Estonia thinking it's going to face down the Russian Navy, on the open seas. Like The Netherlands cannot win a trade war with China. I'm sorry. And why the leaders of that country think this is a shrewd or responsible or even ethical thing to do is beyond me. And last thing I'll say is such behavior does not inspire confidence in the global South. Sort of the Western nations against the 7 billion people of the global South. And if you read their propaganda, the US and Europe are the bad actors and China is fighting for them, which is kind of a perverse way for perhaps a European German audience to read those events. But I could tell you that this is actions like the seizing of that Chinese company. I mean, it's a local company that happens to be owned by a Chinese company. Right? That is not portrayed very well in India, Indonesia, Brazil, and those people matter. There's an enormous number of them, and they're economically consequential. And so it's I think, not quite as bad as seizing the Russian reserves, but it's on the spectrum of that decision.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of, I don't know a lot, but there was a handful of Russian companies operating in Germany or in other places in Europe that were, subsidiaries of, I don't know, Gazprom or some companies like that that were seized in a similar way. And this was very much in the motion of war. And there isn't a war, other than, I mean, there's a trade war, but it's not a kinetic war of any kind with China. So, it really seems like stating the obvious, but clearly the fronts are hardening and there's more and more escalation. And I can't help but think, so what you said before, that most states in Europe or all states in Europe are vassals of the US. And to me, it feels very much like they're being somewhat remote controlled into taking such actions. Because from my perspective, I cannot see a successful flourishing Europe, honestly, without cheap Russian energy and China as a market / collaborator for high tech, right?
And property rights. Without it's...
Well, this is the key. So let's talk about the Russian assets at Euroclear.
Yeah.
Already, an argument will soon be made somewhere in court when Russia decides to pursue those involved. This is tantamount to a default by the European sovereigns who issued the debt that Russia parked its assets in. That's Russia's money. There's no legal basis to seize that money just because there's a war. And because Russia was not paid back when the debts came due, those countries all defaulted on their debt. And there might be a legal hand waving amongst the European crowd when they talk to themselves about it. But there's a reason why gold is at $4,100 an ounce today. And that decision has a big part in it. The debt of European nations and the British debt and the US Treasury debt used to be considered neutral reserve assets for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. The neutrality of those assets has been destroyed. Regardless of the merit of the original decision, the neutrality of those assets has been destroyed, and the only truly neutral reserve asset on the board that the global South can trust to use for the settlement of imbalances in international trade is now gold. Incidentally, I ran some numbers. The increase in value of the gold Russia owned when the war in Ukraine started has now surpassed what is being frozen at Euroclear, which is an interesting thing. Belgium is against, of course, because that is basically the end of Euroclear. So if you're a central banker in, pick your favorite country, can you really trust European debt anymore? Do you really want to park your money with Euroclear, or is there going to be a run? Who would want to roll over France's debt if it just can be canceled and defaulted on? These decisions have second, third, and fourth order consequences that the current slate of leaders, and when they make these impulsive decisions, often don't take the time to consider. Russia will chase every dollar of those reserves till the end of time. That money is all this crazy talk about lending the money to Ukraine and not releasing the frozen assets until Russia basically pays reparations. That's not their money to lend. Take somebody else's money and you use it as collateral, you've stolen their money. Let's call it what it is. But let's have an open and honest discussion about what it means to steal Russia's reserves. And what does it mean for Europe to steal Russia's reserves? Not what it means for Russia. I get it. You hate Putin. You want to punish Russia. Putin's a war criminal. Put him in a tribunal. Whatever you want to tell yourself. What happens to Europe when you freeze and now talk about seizing those assets? This, again, is another reason why we think the EU doesn't survive once this war is over, at least not in its current form. They can print, I suppose, roll France's debt with printing, but then the periphery, Eastern Europe, I mean, we're starting to see cracks already, right? And so the question of what does this mean for Europe and what is best for Europe is rarely asked because, as you mentioned, the Netherlands seized a Chinese-owned company because the US would prefer China not develop advanced AI. That's what happened, right? I mean, all of this goes back to the first Trump administration, Biden administration, the desire to keep high-end semiconductor chips and cutting-edge AI technology out of the hands of the Chinese military is an arbitrary decision that the US has declared is in its national interest. And then suddenly you have what happened this week.
Yeah, Doomberg. A friend sent me a few comments on that news article, but from the Chinese side of the propaganda wall, right? And a lot of the main top comments, if I was to summarize, basically saying, hey, actually, this is a good thing, because then at least the mask is off and you know who the pirates at sea are. So from now on, let it be known and clear, like whoever puts money in the hands of these people or capital in the hands of these people, you should have known better because they're telling you who they are. So you better believe it.
And the same, yep, go ahead, sorry.
No, I just want to say, like, I grew up in Southeast Asia and the West was always seen as this beacon of, trying to do the right thing. You park your money there, it'll be safe. They care about freedom of speech, they care about human rights, etc. Right? And it's so weird for me to see how the West is happy to let all of that erode for, like what you said, the other 7 billion people on the planet at such an alarming pace, and they don't even realize that they're doing it, or they don't care that they're doing it. But it seems like such a shame.
I think there's a competency crisis amongst the European political elite. They're just not that smart. I'm sorry, but like Kaja Kallas is not that smart. Ursula von der Leyen is not that smart. Robert Habeck was not that smart. Friedrich Merz, whenever I hear him speak, I don't find him to be particularly inspiring. Look, this is basically fourth turning generational type stuff. The Great Reset, the current fiscal situation in the West was always unsustainable. How that situation would ultimately resolve, you kind of always knew there'd have to be war. And so here we are. This is why we describe this as World War III, by the way, because that's what it is in our mind. There is going to be a reckoning. And freedom of speech in the US, in many ways, was and frankly still is under assault. There will come a time where we won't be able to publish what we publish or say what we say. We're still protected so far, but somebody will buy Substack and snuff it out at some point. So we note with interest, CBS buying the Free Press, which was kind of interesting. Inside baseball, I suppose, because Free Press is one of the biggest Substacks in the world. So, but to your point, when we read the propaganda of the rest of the world, the seizing of a Chinese company is viewed as you say, piracy, which it is, and the rest of the world is going to react. And by the way, we think this is going to lead to a great bifurcation between the G7 aligned billion people and the Global South aligned 7 billion people. And they're developing the payment systems and the settlement systems and the mutual trust. And I think the United Nations Security Council is not going to survive. Certainly not in its current form. The United Nations is basically useless at the moment. Its resolutions are ignored or flouted with impunity, which makes it basically useless. So the Global South will self-police. China will be at the center of it. Russia will be near the center of it. And then the US will be the center of the rest of the world, which is probably fine, but that's where we're headed.
Okay, so to try to pivot all this, right, into the aforementioned reconstruction or whatever we call it, I had this idea of turning Doomberg into Boonberg on the show to see how we can find the positives, right? So I think we're spending way too much time talking about the EU because at the end of the day, it's actually, in the grand scheme of things, pretty irrelevant. However, of course, not for the 500 something million people that live here. When you look at who's running the show, and even after the latest European elections, which was very obvious that they wanted something completely different than they then got in after the internal parliamentary procedures, it's turned this government for our government into one of the least democratic entities, I think, in the West. And therefore, I'm actually happy if it falls apart, right? What are the positives, right? Like what comes out of that? And maybe, maybe not just hinging it on Europe itself, but just generally, if there is a power transition, right? So basically, if the US empire, so to speak, after its amazing run, right? Like one of the biggest empire in modern history with a really good run, but what are the potential benefits? And I guess maybe asking more, maybe make the question more easily answerable. Who benefits first, right?
Yeah. So we are actually optimistic people.
Mhm.
We think once we get through this period of friction, here's what President Doomberg would do, what we hoped Trump would do, which is only partially done. Settle the Middle East, easier said than done, but reach a deal with Iran in particular. You can't necessarily settle the Palestinian question, but you could certainly settle the Iranian question. There's no need for the perpetual threat of war. And so you take the L in Ukraine. You just have to recognize that the war is lost. You do your best to preserve what's left of Ukraine for the Ukrainians. And then you develop a better relationship with whoever replaces Putin. Putin won't be there forever. Lavrov won't be there forever. Europe better hope that the successor to Putin isn't to his right. We strongly suspect that the successor to Putin will be far to Putin's right, which is a whole different scenario. And that then Trump cuts a long-term deal with Russia and China. We smoothly transition to a multipolar world. The U.S.'s sphere of influence is Western Hemisphere. Middle East is settled. No war with China. The Taiwan issue is settled along the lines of the Hong Kong issue, hopefully without any missiles being fired or carriers being sunk. And everybody has their known spheres. Wars are minimized. And in that scenario, we'll see a boom. We'll see a boom in Europe. We'll see a reconstruction boom in Ukraine. We'll see a boom in the Middle East. The U.S. is a global energy gigapower. It produces the most oil, the most natural gas, has the largest coal reserves, has a fleet of 90 nuclear reactors. There's an enormous amount of oil and gas in Central and Southern America. Argentina with Vaca Muerta. There's the whole Venezuela situation. There's Mexico. If they could just get rid of the criminal gangs, they could produce 3, 4, 5 times what they're producing today. Canada has got one of the largest hydrocarbon resources in the world. There's plenty to eat at home in the Western Hemisphere for the U.S. to occupy itself with. Europe could restart its nuclear reactors, and by Europe we mean Germany. Europe could lift the ban on fracking. It could begin to develop its own fossil fuel resources. We could discard this net zero nonsense. Political uprisings will be recognized and adhered to because this is the will of the people. As you correctly say, when Ursula von der Leyen says our democracy, the emphasis must be on the word our, because she has a whole different meaning of the word democracy than you and I would have. And I see that you took a sip from the totally agree mug as you were saying that, which is for longtime Doomberg subscribers will know that's how we used to answer critics on Twitter when they would rage at how stupid we were. We would just reply, totally agree, which was a fun way to navigate social media. So there is a boom to be had. This too shall pass. I mean, look, Japan had 2 nuclear bombs dropped on it, and by the it was a global manufacturing superpower. Let's hope no nuclear bombs are dropped now. There is a world where Europe and Russia can coexist peacefully. Let's get to that world. There's a world where the Middle East need not be a powder keg. Let's get to that world. There's a world where China and the US do not need to be in a trade war. The tensions in Taiwan can be solved as a Chinese problem, which it is. It's the result of the way the Civil War ended in the 40s. We actually wrote a piece predicting that the Koreas might reconcile, a higher probability event than most have on their board. So there's lots to be done. There's still a Nord Stream pipeline that's connected. The gas pipelines connecting Russia to Europe still exist. Yes, Power Siberia 2 is being built, but Russia has an enormous amount of natural gas. We model global natural gas supplies to be infinite for the purposes of our economic modeling. And so we would love to live in a world where we aren't careening from neocon war to neocon war for the sake of it. That's not a popular thing to say in America today, but when you're in the bomb making business, peace is a working capital problem. So forever thus, suddenly we're firing on boats in Venezuela, and so it's hard to see sometimes that there is a way better way to live than the one we're currently executing.
I mean, that gives us everybody some hope, right? And you think with what China's doing with rare earths, that might throw a spanner in the works for, military industrial complex leading decisions on where soldiers go. Like if you don't have the supply chain, you can't go fight infinite wars, right?
This is the most fascinating thing. We did a full analysis of China for our pro tier last year. And just to clarify, like our annual subscribers get all of our newsletters, and then if you pay a little more, you get a monthly webinar from the Doomberg team, a 45-minute presentation where we'll do a deep dive on something. We're toying about doing a deep dive on the Congo for October, although that's not finalized yet. We just did one on India last month. So last July, I think it was, we did a presentation called The Year of the Dragon, China Through the Lens of Energy. And when you do a deep dive on China through the lens of energy, physics is the ultimate arbiter. In that presentation, we described China as the new arsenal of democracy because they make all the Western weapons. You can't go to war with your weapons manufacturer. This whole talk about pivoting to Asia and confronting China that we hear from the bipartisan intent in Washington, we don't actually model the U.S. as Republicans and Democrats. We model the U.S. as 80% war party, 20% outcasts on the left and right, Trump being an outcast on the right. And most of Congress is against Trump, by the way. People think that the Republicans have complete control over power. No, they don't. Trump has control of the presidency, and the Uniparty runs Congress, and everything else is theater. So the arsenal of democracy is China. And we're finding that out. So your important observation, and I didn't say it when you first said it, but it came to my mind, and then you asked me a different question. China is stopping the export of drones except to Russia. And suddenly Russia is making 600, 700 high-powered long-distance drones a day and is executing a devastating strike on Ukrainian natural gas and its electricity grid. I should say that this is a war crime. Putin is committing a war crime. The wanton destruction of primarily civilian energy assets is a war crime. But I would also say that the phrase war crime is oxymoronic. All elements of war ultimately are criminal, in our view. China is picking sides. It's decided that the war in Ukraine has gone on long enough, and the U.S. has been weakened enough, and it has strengthened itself enough that it can play a decisive role in Russia bringing the war to an end. And it will rob the West of the critical parts it needs. Well, not rob. It will keep possession of what the West needs that the West foolishly allowed China to monopolize in the name of efficiency and quarterly earnings and executive stock options. Raytheon and Boeing and all of these companies are critically dependent on China. It's a dirty little secret. And China believes, which is the point of the piece we're writing, that it will emerge victorious.
So Jason knows more about this than me, but in a way, this is this fits culturally quite well because right, it's like very art of war style, right? You try to win the war before ever firing a shot, kind of a thing. So with all, obviously, as a Westerner myself, I understand that this is also a threat to my way of life. However, I find it actually way more elegant. I'm way more okay with that way of fighting than as we've been accustomed to in the last couple of decades.
And let's be honest. If the U.S. wasn't trying to restrict Chinese access to high-end semiconductors and the technologies to manufacture them, China would not be trying to create its own manufacturing supply chain with the urgency that it is doing, and it would not be withholding rare earths.
Yeah.
These are reactions by China to what they correctly perceive as American provocations.
Yeah, I would agree. And so, here in Europe, often I hear people, the average European is not a friend of Trump, right? He's the orange clown who, got elected by some accident, and basically that means Americans must be retarded. But is what people would say at the bar. And where was I going with this? But then I often remind them and say, well, how come Germany or the EU at large is so dependent on what the US says and thinks and does, right? If you feel your livelihood is in danger because of who becomes the US president, what does that say about yourself? And they're like, yeah, of course, like we actually need to stand more on our own legs. And why are we a vassal? But there's, of course, that whole piece of history, that they're in fact a vassal and that the US is an empire. That's all missing from their awareness sphere. And then, of course, if you're missing all that, making sense of the world as it is right now is very, very tough. But interestingly, Trump's first term, I think the trade war that he started, I think a lot of people were taken very aback. Also, the Chinese were caught off guard by it. But it's been several years since then, and they have not slept on the issue, whereas everybody else seems to have, right? So Trump getting reelected was always a likelihood, even, whether you judge the probability high or not, that's kind of besides the point, but it was always a thing that could have happened. And if you did nothing, if you learned nothing from the first term, then you got nobody else to blame other than yourself.
Yeah. But look, Trump's a controversial figure. We've been somewhat critical of him a few times on this podcast, but also he's not a person to be underestimated. Again, I live in flyover country. And anecdotally, I will tell you, he held a rally about 30 miles from where I live. I didn't go to the rally, but I went to the periphery of the rally. I wanted to just go get a sense of it. And if those in Europe had gone to the periphery of the rally that I went to, you would have not been surprised that he won the election. For some reason, Trump generates an enormous popularity amongst blue-collar, working-class people who have been most heavily impacted by the outsourcing of U.S. manufacturing to China. Now, why this particular billionaire creates that? Don't need to know, just need to know that it works, that the model works. Trump was always going to win this election, especially considering the great scandal that is Joe Biden and the cover-up of his obvious mental decline from when he was running back in 2020. This will be one of the great scandals of American history, the Autopen scandal, which is probably, I'm guessing, not getting very much press in the Western European periodicals. Joe Biden was mentally unfit to be president. It was clear in the debate. What amazed me is just how shocked people were in the debate. I mean, anybody who has a parent or a grandparent with a history of dementia, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, would see the signs of what was going on. And it's a great scandal what happened. The U.S. is in the middle of a civil war, an undeclared civil war, but it's real. And Trump is the commanding officer of half of the United States. This is unfortunate, but this is how you have to model it. One of the things that we're quite concerned about, not to stray too far off topic, our analysis of history is that once a country starts arresting its former presidents, it's really hard to stop. And the US started arresting its former presidents in 2023 when the Biden administration, through its proxies, decided to arrest and make Trump a felon. Now the whirlwind is being reaped. The logical conclusion from such a mental model is that once you start arresting former presidents, the power and party doesn't want to leave. You have crippled your ability to do a peaceful transition. Perhaps the one we just did will be the last. Because if you know that you're going to, let's do the thought experiment. If the Democrats get control of Washington in 2028, do you doubt that virtually every member of the Trump administration will be arrested for something? And this comes down to a real challenge in the Western world, which is the average American citizen commits 3 felonies a day. There's a book with that title, 3 felonies a day. When there's so many laws and regulations that you can't even keep track of them and you inadvertently commit a felony without even knowing it, all prosecutions are selective prosecutions. And so we have in place a very toxic brew of retribution. To see, sure you guys aren't following the saga of the Attorney General of New York, Miss James, who was the one who went after Trump. Trump allegedly inflated the value of some buildings to get loans, which, mind you, he paid back in full with interest and no bank ever complained about. Somehow this was upgraded to a felony because any misdemeanor that uses a bank becomes bank fraud. And this is how they took down the poker websites, by the way. And so while she's running on, quote, getting Trump and prosecuting Trump for this, apparently, allegedly, she's now been accused of mortgage fraud and taking a mortgage on a home that she claimed would be a residence, but she then rented it out. And so, that's just proof that nobody's clean. If everybody's dirty, all prosecutions are selective. If the United States government wanted to make me a felon, it could rifle through everything I've ever done and find felonies. That doesn't make me a felon, doesn't make me a criminal. I try to be a law-abiding citizen. I pay my taxes to the best of my ability. I don't mind paying taxes. The more taxes I make, the more money I'm making. But if the local prosecutor said, I don't like what Doomberg wrote, and I'm going to get Doomberg, they'd get Doomberg. And there's nothing I can do about it. It's pretty scary, actually. This is where the U.S. is today.
I mean, this is what everybody is scared of when we talk about the condition of life in Soviet Russia, right? This is, I think, the kind of day-to-day threat that everybody would feel in like a really oppressive regime, and it's I mean, it's scary, sad to have to worry about that in your own
Sure.
country, right?
And your commentary reminds me of an excellent DM I once got from somebody who claimed to live in East Germany, who was a Doomberg subscriber. And he said, quite sadly, that what he was seeing in the West was people retreating to the serenity of their private gardens, which is what they used to do in East Germany when the news of the day would be too much for them to engage with, and they would just go to the serenity of their private gardens. He was characterizing the Doomberg comment section as the private garden, because at least our comment section is limited to paying subscribers only, and is generally pretty polite and pretty lively and pretty well informed. We have a few stray comments here and there that we have to decide to delete or not, but by and large, it's pretty intellectually stimulating to participate in the comments. I enjoy doing it. And that's a phrase that has stuck with me. I'm a big believer in optimizing my micro environment, my home, my office, the cars that I use to get between them, the restaurants I enjoy eating at. One definition of rich is the biggest tipper in a small town. And so you can create a microenvironment for you, but it also can be a coping mechanism to escape the macro. And we're seeing that now in the US and in Western Europe, I think. And it's quite sad. The European Commission is teetering towards totalitarianism. And anybody who doesn't recognize that is either blind or in on it. I'm free to say it here because the long arm of the European Commission does not yet reach to the Midwestern United States. And with J.D. Vance as vice president, I doubt they would have the courage to do something about it. But J.D. Vance might not be vice president forever. So is what it is. There are people being arrested by their hundreds in Britain because of tweets. That's how far Britain has fallen. It's a dystopian nightmare. I would never visit Britain. I certainly wouldn't park any money there.
So, Doomberg, you don't give financial advice, but maybe you could give some advice to listeners that might be living in the West and have the opportunity to be mobile. If you think that there's a chance or high likelihood that we will be rubbing shoulders with totalitarianism again, do you think getting out before the walls come up is something to consider?
No, at least certainly not in America. I plan to defend my castle, literally and figuratively. I don't think it's too far gone. I think it's worth fighting to protect. Such leaders are unpopular. There's only so long you could suppress political uprisings. As we like to say, on the path from abundance to starvation is riot, political and then physical. We're still in the political phase of that riot today in Europe. These leaders are unpopular and incompetent and are incapable of suppressing the free will of the people they claim to lead. And these are not people who are capable of running a totalitarian regime. They have totalitarian instincts, but they do not have the threat to back it up. In particular, in the United States, the Second Amendment makes the United States pretty impenetrable. And there might be a splitting up of the United States. So the coasts might find their way, but Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana, they're not going to put up with much more nonsense from the feds. And there's nothing that the feds can really do about it. The United States is still, let's put it this way, Texas is more sovereign than Germany is. Texas within the United States of America is more sovereign than Germany is within the European Union by a wide margin. Florida too. And it works both ways. California is more sovereign than France is. And so, but no, a second passport, I'd rather die on the hill, intellectually, physically, than to run away from the problem. And look, we take chances with our writing, right? I mean, it's not guaranteed that we'll be able to continue to create such a great business that we've come to love and enjoy that has financially transformed the families of the founders. It's been great. It's been a great ride. I think we're popular because we try our best to speak the truth. We admit when we're wrong and we show our homework. It's not that hard. And this is what's missing from the modern media world. Legacy media needs to collapse. They lie constantly all the time. By the way, the worst propaganda in the world is British propaganda, in case you're wondering, having read them all. British propaganda is by far the worst, like terrible. A far better contra indicator than an indicator of any truth.
So we should read it just to know what not to invest in or see where the world is not going towards.
It's always important to read what your adversary or your allies are telling themselves. It's just data. It's just information.
Yeah. So just one clarifying question on that. So do you consider all All what do you mainstream media propaganda, or do you specifically like how do you find the channels? Like what's news and what's propaganda?
There are many people who work in legacy media who are not propagandists. I want to be very
Yeah.
clear.
I would think so, right? So that's why it's like,
Yes.
how do you tell it apart?
You have to become skilled in the art of partitioning signal from noise. Not to break too much news, but we're actually pondering writing a book on the subject because it's a skill that I think makes Doomberg unique, and it is teachable. So over time, I know what Fox News is. I know what Sky News is. I know what the BBC is. I know what The Economist is. I know what the Financial Times is. So take the Financial Times. The Financial Times is an amazing mix of really outstanding original reporting and utter nonsense, like
Right.
laughable nonsense, right? Like, are you feeding me this BS? You honestly, what is this stuff, right? And so we'll routinely quote the Financial Times for when it does a good piece of hard reporting, like it did on the Mexico cartel and oil and gas situation. It was an incredible piece of investigative reporting. And the same newspaper puts this nonsense story about van der Leyen's GPS being jammed by the Russians as she flies over Bulgaria. As we said in the piece, keeping van der Leyen in her job must be one of Moscow's top strategic priorities because she's so terrible at it that it weakens Europe. Why would they want van der Leyen out of that seat? Right? That's when we knew that story was bogus from the moment we read it. It couldn't be that Russia did that. Because why would Putin want van der Leyen off the scene? She's great for them. And so, and of course, that story ultimately was never retracted, although I think it should have been, because basically none of the main accusations in it turned out to be true. But just to show you how far the propaganda has come, one of our subscribers from Germany unsubscribed and wrote a nasty note because of that intro and its tone, because it's just so incongruent with the propaganda that they're swimming in that it can be unsettling and even angering to read an alternative view. So to your question, everything is either propaganda or impacted by propaganda. There's still signal to be found out there. And even noise can be instructive. Why is the field being flooded with noise? What does that tell us, right? And as lateral thinkers, the characteristic of a lateral thinker is you have no emotional attachment to the axiom that you're brainstorming around. Most linear thinkers have a desire to make sure that axiom is correct before they'll brainstorm around it. Not so with a lateral thinker. So, for example, that's how we called Mark Carney becoming Canadian Prime Minister before he was even a contract you can bet on Polymarket, because we developed a mental model that said Donald Trump wants Mark Carney to be Canadian Prime Minister. That nobody had that on their radar, but we decided to explore that as a brainstorming anyway, and it started to line up. And so we wrote about it in December in a piece called Alberta Clipper, which is up there. You could go find it. And we predicted that Carney would replace Trudeau, and Carney would run a far more formidable campaign against the Conservatives than was being modeled. The Conservatives had a 93% chance to win that election on Polymarket when we wrote that article, and that 93 went to zero because we were right. That's an example of having no emotional attachment to the axiom, brainstorming around it, beginning to believe it, having it graduate to a mental model, and then having the courage to write about it under our masthead, which, by the way, we have many mental models we don't write about under the masthead because they have to have a certain degree of likelihood before we'll risk the brand. If we get too much wrong, we'll lose our subscribers, and somebody will take our place in the market for ideas.
Excellent. So basically, I'd just like to get a little bit more precise on the hopium, so to speak. You know, empires die, but the people stick around. I don't know, whatever infrastructure there is will stick around, right? In the US. But let's just talk about the US. What does the craftsman, the engineer, you know, the people that actually have real skills, the small producers, what do they make? How do they work their way out of this?
Look, the US has enormous potential. The US has the largest, most sophisticated array of natural gas pipelines in the world and an infinite supply of dirt cheap natural gas. One of our mental models that we've been brainstorming around, and we presented it in our Pro Talk, was in the US, natural gas is infinite and it costs nothing to bring to the surface. What does that mean for the economy? Well, one of the things it means that the hundreds of cogeneration facilities that make electricity and industrial grade steam have a huge head start globally. Again, the US produces 20 million barrels a day of oil using the expansive definition of oil that we think is the right one. It produces now 107 BCF per day of natural gas. Just to calibrate you, before the war in Ukraine, Europe was getting about 15 BCF per day from Russia. So the US produces 6 times more natural gas than all of Europe was importing from Russia before the war. Most of that gas is consumed internally. It's trapped internally. Gas is negatively priced in the Permian Basin today because you can't give it away. They pay people to take the cleanest burning hydrocarbon on the board. The US has deep water ports. It's got the Mississippi River system. It's got amazing farmland. It's got great institutions. It's got a history of democratic ideals, which can be easily resuscitated. Not easily, can be resuscitated. There's much hope to be had in the US, much more hope in the US than in Europe, for example, although perhaps Europe being closer to the bottom than the US might be a reason to be hopeful. But the ingredients, the most important ingredient is energy. Energy is life. Your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to harvest. And maybe I'll close this answer with a indictment of Europe. So today, the Statistical Review of World Energy publishes every June. It's like Christmas Day for us. And last year, they started separating out the European Union as a separate line item. So we did some math. The European Union consumes 38 exajoules of hydrocarbons each year, and it produces about 5. 33 exajoules is roughly the size of the entire US natural gas market. That's the energy bill that Europe must pay before heavy industry can do anything. When you import hydrocarbons, you're paying the cost of capital of everybody involved in getting the molecules from the ground to you. The driller in the US, the midstreamer who brings it to the LNG liquefaction plant, the carrier that steams across the ocean and brings it to you, the gasification plant where it offloads, and the pipelines and the midstreamers that bring it to the power plant. Everybody involved in that has to earn their cost of capital before you burn it. You can't have an industry like that. You can't have a war machine like that. You can't have a military industrial complex like that. You literally don't have the jewels to do it. The US is not in that situation. The US is a global energy gigapower, and it has still a manufacturing base. And I can tell you one thing, Washington, D.C. is going all in on reshoring, onshoring. Some of our contacts in D.C. have told us some pretty remarkable things about what's coming. The U.S. will come out of this in amazing shape, assuming we don't have nuclear war. And if we could create the peace structure that we outlined earlier, Europe will reach bottom soon and we'll turn the corner. Huge cultural changes will need to take place in Europe. We need to re-embrace energy and its primal role in creating a standard of living. It needs to refocus on its constituencies, on the sovereign nations, not the collective. The European project has failed. It just hasn't been recognized yet. So that's my hopium, at least for the US.
I think that, I think actually the EU, that political legal construct of the EU collapsing would be a breath of fresh air for the European ideal as the people live it, if that makes sense. Because I think a lot of this bureaucracy and this there's this joke like the Europeans love government so much that's why we built a government for a government type of thing. It is such a overburdening feeling for me anyway to live here that I think if that layer was removed, it would actually release so much energy, human capital type of energy that would allow people to be creative and productive again. And maybe also keep some more of what they actually earn, right? That in itself would make me very bullish, and etc. So reshoring, onshoring US is underway. That's good to hear. That's a necessary step, right? Because all the energy in the world needs a productive outlet, right? Like you said, if the gas in the Permian Basin is currently trading at negative prices, then let's put some factories nearby that can make stuff that will take
data centers, and of course.
Exactly. So you said there's a cultural shift is needed, and I heard you speak on a different show about a new project that you guys have launched, and I was really curious to see what your motivation is. So I think it's called Classics Read Out Loud. Is that right?
Classics Read Aloud, one word.
Aloud.
Yeah, so classicsreadaloud.substack.com. Thank you for bringing it up. I was going to plug it at the end if you didn't. One of the founders of Doomberg is very passionate about classic literature, the way things used to be, I suppose. AI is an affront to her. She's also the editor of Doomburg, and she does a brilliant job editing our pieces. You mentioned the quality of the writing. The pieces are a collaboration between me, the head writer, and the editor. And she decided to pursue her passion and has a great voice. We've set up a really good podcast studio. We've invested in developing this new brand in the same way that we did the Doomberg project, excellence across all dimensions within our control. And we actually study our ideal customers quite carefully at Doomberg, and there's a strong overlap between people who like to subscribe to Doomberg and people we think would be very interested in brilliant short stories, novellas, and novels read and edited in a way that is very pleasing to the ear. And so we launched the product in September, classicsreadaloud.substack.com. It's already over like 23 or 2,400 subscribers, which is amazing, fast growing for Substack standards. Many of those are, of course, Doomberg crossovers. To the extent that somebody enjoys both projects, then there's probably somebody we want to meet because they are the synthesis of the Doomberg team. And if you're interested in such things, if you have commutes in the morning or you like to listen to stories on your walks, it's a great project. I would encourage everybody listening to go check it out. Thank you for giving me the chance to pitch it.
Well, so the thought that it triggered hearing about it is that this is really, in a way, putting your money where your mouth is, or both your money and your effort where your mouth is. Because I haven't checked it out yet, but I assume, or basically reinvigorating and finding a new audience for classic literature does something very positive for reinvigorating an aspect of culture, right? And I think that is, with all everything that's going on, I think that there's a real cultural identity issue in the West that maybe what we've all talked about today creates that, or there's probably like an interplay between the different worlds of problems or whatever conflicts. But I think it's really cool that you guys are finding a creative way to try to reinvigorate a piece of culture, basically.
Sure, and if anybody's interested, we wrote a free piece called Get To, where we launched this project. And our firm belief in life, and maybe this is like the ultimate hopium that we could wrap up on, is that if you perform work that feels like you get to do it, you can be incredibly productive. And this is something we obsess over. So we call it our have to get to ratio. If I look at my calendar, how much of my day is have to do and how much of my day is get to do. And here's a very powerful life hack. Pay somebody to do all your have to do's. Pay them handsomely. And bet on yourself that if you only work on get to do's, you will make an enormous amount of money. Because you will approach the project with an enthusiasm unknown to mankind, as Jim Harbaugh, a famous football coach in the US, likes to say to his teams during his pregame speeches. For the editor of Doomberg, finding a brilliant short story, putting down a nice reading of it, writing an introductory essay to it, adding a few et ceteras at the end of it, and then responding to the emails of the people who enjoyed it is a get-to-do activity for her. And this is the only way that you can produce research and writing Doomberg pieces and defending it on podcasts and then being on the internet all day looking for the next one. What a life. I get to earn a living doing this. Like, are you kidding me with this? Right? For real? Right? There's certain aspects of the job that are have to do. Guess what? Paid somebody to do it. Take a little bit of the subscription money and outsource the landscaping, right? It's a wonderful way to live. We have made the transition from labor to capital. Our efforts accrue to ourselves and our families. I'm not afraid of my phone. I can't be fired. I don't have to go to any meetings. I don't schedule any meetings. The only thing on my calendar is podcast appearances and writing. That's it. And it's a wonderful way to live. I wish more people would do it. And so, yes, there's a cultural part of it, but it's a get-to-do activity for her. And that's why the product is such a high quality.
That sounds fantastic. And even if Substack gets bought and shut down, you guys still own the contact list, right?
And look, it's been a great experience. If it stopped tomorrow, it'd be the most important thing I ever did in my life. What a pleasure. I got to do it.
Yeah, awesome. Jason, last comments, remarks, questions.
No, man. I actually wanted to ask the last question, what drives the chicken coop, and any words of advice for other content creators. But I think, Doomberg, you said it perfect. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Only thing I would add to that question is if you want to be a content creator, you have to learn to be a marketer, because otherwise your content will just be tossed to the crowded bin of great stuff never read. And many content creators are too proud to market their content, and many people will sneer at the green chicken. Well, the green chicken was a marketing coup, and that's one of the reasons why the project succeeded. And that's why we maintain the anonymity, because we don't want to dissipate the brand. It's more about brand now than anything else. And so we wrote a piece, another one, if you want to get inspired to be a content creator, called These Shares Won't Sell Themselves, or maybe it was These Shares Aren't Going to Sell Themselves. It was about the Eames share and the marketing of the Eames
Right. Yeah.
as they develop their products. One of our favorite pieces. And then another one I would recommend from the old Work of My Life archives is Strange Victory, where we talked about the disease of more and not falling into the trap of always wanting more? Could we go raise investor money and build Doomberg media empire? Of course we could. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to, when you find what you're meant to be doing in life, for heaven's sake, just keep doing it. I was not sent here to build companies with vast numbers of employees. Doomberg was built on the efforts of a shockingly small number of people with no money. I don't need to go be the free press. I could, but then I'd be doing an awful lot of have-to-do activities, and I don't want to do any of those. So, guys, look, it was great. I really appreciate it. Thanks for giving me the chance to plug Classics Read Aloud. And obviously, people can just go to doomberg.com and find all of our work there, but they probably already knew that at this point.
Thank you so much, Doomberg. Feel free to just jump off. Jason and I always do a little recap after this.
And that wraps up our main conversation. But we're not done yet. We're going into overtime, where Jason and I unpack some insights, reflect on what just happened, and connect a few dots. And go.
Yeah, what do you feel? How do you feel?
I honestly don't know why people say don't meet your heroes, because I just definitely met one of mine, and I think it was awesome. The whole conversation was several times throughout, I thought to myself, I cannot believe that I'm having this conversation right now, because it is, I don't know, it's weird. It feels like a mix of vindication, even though I don't even know what about, because my beliefs are my own, and I don't actually feel the need to vindicate them in any way. But it feels like, maybe that's not the right word. Maybe it just feels like, maybe it's just one of these things when you find somebody who's in your crowd, or whose crowd you wish to be in, even, and you end up hitting it off in a way. Maybe it felt like that. Maybe it felt like, being at a gathering and you meet somebody and you're like, well, we could actually be great friends, and you have a great conversation. And throughout this conversation, I really had that feeling several times.
Yeah. Agree. Totally agree. I just felt grateful that we started the podcast and had Doomberg definitely on the dream list amongst other people that we've already talked to. And so for me, it's just huge to see what happens when you put in some energy and how the universe conspires yet again, right? With the ripple effects of what you're doing and the impacts you're trying to make.
I mean, the conversation we've had, right, is nothing short of sobering, but I think, you and I really set out to bring out a little bit of the positive outlook, like after the collapse, what comes next. And I think that actually worked much better than I was worried. I mean, I was a little worried it might not work, right? That we don't get to talk about the upswing of things. I do think that in the short term, or in the short to medium term, next 3 to 5 years, I do generally think that it's gonna be tough, right? But I think that every crisis brings opportunity, and so to me, also part of being free also means that I can position myself to try and make the best of it. And I think, to some degree, there's no escaping crisis, right? Even if you could move to an island somewhere where, all your needs were taken care of, and you wouldn't, you would be completely on the outside of all of this political, economic conflict. Well, then who knows? Maybe you might get cancer, right? Like, I'm just saying, like, if there's going to be volatility in your life, it can take so many different shapes and forms. And you really have no choice other than to embrace volatility. So, in many ways, right? You and I talk about this a lot. Like, I've been living between the US and Germany for the last few years, and I'm very much set on, if the powers that be will let me obtain my green card and move to the US more permanently. And I am really, really unsure if that's the right move. But my gut says it is, right? But from all the surface level things, I'm like, well, really, do I really want to move, like, kind of to the belly of the beast, right in the middle of a lot of this cultural war and potentially civil war, right? Like Doomberg says, the civil war is already going. It sounds terrifying. Is that really what I want? Do I want to take my kids there and stuff? But then on the other hand, my gut says, I've always had an easier time, making lemonade out of lemons in America. That's why my business is there. That's why I married an American woman. That's why when I'm there, I just feel more free, right? And in a selfish way, this conversation with Doomy really helped me kind of see and maybe in the future able to articulate a bit better why, right? So that America is a giga powerhouse of energy, and he's like, well, Texas is way more sovereign in the U.S. than Germany is to Europe, or Germany is to the U.S. probably. Like that explains a lot, right? And it felt good for him to say it out loud because it articulates something that I've kind of maybe felt or thought, but I didn't really know to say. Does that make sense? So for me, very selfishly, this was great. And yeah, and strife and volatility, and you could even go as far as suffering is part of life. And it really just comes down to not suffering, struggle, right? Like I definitely hold a firm belief that some form of struggle is a inevitable part of life, and really just comes down to struggling well. Like you choose the hard, right? Like there was this whole saying, it was like, oh, being married is hard, well, being single is hard, being skinny or staying skinny is hard, but being overweight is hard too. Like you just have to choose your hard, right? Having kids is super hard, but never having kids is also super hard, right? So you just have to pick the thing that works for you. So I'm actually a bit shocked now recounting this, that this was much more, I took way more philosophical, like life advice type stuff away from this than I thought. I thought this was way more just geopolitics discussion, of which we had our fair share of, but I feel like we went pretty deep.
Yeah, man. I didn't manage to ask him where he thought gold was going, etc., just because there was so much more philosophical gold nuggets to tease out from him. Yeah.
Yeah. What does it mean to you? Like you asked him, like, hey, mobility, right? Like, should you just get out of Dodge? Like, what did you think of his reply?
I think it's probably location dependent, right? Like if I was imagining being located in Texas or the Midwest, I think it's very different from, I don't know, being in London right now. He says he likes being away from big cities. So in a way, he's already been mobile and got himself somewhere away from the throng, right? So I think, yeah, if you found your castle, that's good, but maybe you're in a place right now that will not handle turmoil or volatility as well as where he's at. And I don't know. I mean, there were plenty of people that lived behind the Iron Curtain for decades, right? I don't really feel like I want to sign up to live like that, I don't love any castles enough to say I'm going to be living somewhere with my movement curtailed. And maybe that's just me.
No. I think for you, I'm reminded of what LVG said, right? The people of the trees and the people of the boats. If you anticipate an Iron Curtain situation here in Central Europe, I would absolutely tell you to get out in the best, in the most loving, best possible way. I don't think you should get caught in that situation, especially since you're aware that this is a probability, right?
I mean, look at what happened, right, with China seizing that Dutch company. What does that mean? It means
not China.
Sorry. Yeah. The Dutch seizing the company that's owned by the Chinese, right?
Right.
It just means, why would you invest anything in Europe right now? And if that's the case, if money doesn't flow, then what does? Because if capital is not allowed to flow, then what's next? Like, I'm just looking 2 dominoes ahead, or maybe just 1 domino ahead. What does that mean? I mean, remember the person I told you about that owns a Chinese semiconductor company, then bought another company in Bremen, and then bought another company in the US so that he could, build a business with a more global footprint and be more competitive. He's doing everything that you once supposed to do when you grow up and think of the world as this connected platform with which you take strengths and weaknesses into play, and then you create a global company, right? Which is what most mega companies have done and has to do to survive. But what just happened basically takes a a sledgehammer to that ideal. Yeah, I don't know. It's pretty shocking, and I think most people haven't realized it yet. Like, I think, with what happened in the past with Iran and then with Russia, people thought, yeah, that's just those bad rogue actor type people. You managed to convince everybody that Putin's a rogue actor, and so every Russian has to be punished. Okay, but China, like, China makes every single thing that we touch almost. Or
China
so,
has made our standard of living in the last 20 years even possible.
exactly.
In Europe, you don't notice it as much. In the US, where you can buy a 70-inch flat screen, and many people have like 4 or 5 of these freaking things in their house, and they cost like $300. That's only possible because of this insane scale of Chinese manufacturing. And this is a really dumb example, right? But the reason US has this higher standard of living, even relative to Europe, is because they, until very recently, had almost no import restrictions, no tariffs on China at all. Right? That's what allowed them to have this good life, right? And so now to turn around and say, "Oh, but that's why you guys are bad," it's like it's the most ridiculous attitude to take.
Yeah. So let's see how China retaliates, right? But if everything you touch somehow has a supply chain that interfaces with China, and then you just went to give a very strong signal to this entity that you're not welcome here, your things are not safe with us, yeah, I don't really want to see what's on the other side of that. And the funniest thing is, I don't even know what the upside is for Europe to behave in such a way.
There
So
isn't.
if there's no upside and you're doing something with tremendous downside, and at the same time you're saying, hey, grow some roots and pay more than 50% of your utility or productivity to this entity that is picking fights with superpowers that make everything that you use, I don't know. It just doesn't seem like a good concoction.
No, and then I mean, you're made felt bad about even buying the awesome products, right? The Merc, right, that you drive. Many people would want to shame you for even turning the key, right? Burning
Yeah, by
those.
the way, I drive a 20-year-old Mercedes that I love very much.
It's awesome. It was made during the height of of German car engineering. It's fantastic, right? But then you wouldn't believe the amount of guilt you get for just
Literally, these are my house keys. I went for a drink with some colleagues. I put my keys on the table, and the first thing this guy says, I've never had a beer with him in my life, and the first thing this guy says is, he looks at me with a stern look, and he says, "You drive a Mercedes?" And then he starts shaking his head. Why would you do that? I was like, geez. Nice to meet you too. Yeah. So you're right. So
it's just unsustainable, right? Like I had a teacher in, what was it, 6th, which grade, 5th grade maybe, or was it later? I don't remember. I mean, it might have been as early. No, I think it wasn't. It was, so then let it be 10th grade, right? And it was like political science type equivalent in Germany, and she put up this this slide, right, on the projector, before there was beamers. And she said, "Hey guys, just wanted to let you guys know, your generation has to take really, really good care of the automotive industry in Germany, because it is literally the wealth of our nation. Like if you like the standard of living that you have, like if you think that, Germany is a good place to live, this industry is why, right? So please don't, like, if you learn anything in my class, basically, she's like, just take that away. Like, don't kill the German car industry, right?" And she was telling this to, 16-year-olds. So we're all like, "Huh? What are you talking about?" And it's amazing, what, 20 plus years later, 22, 3 years later, how right she was.
We should bring her on the podcast.
Yeah.
I mean, she should have told her peers, right? Because I don't understand the amount of self-loathing that goes around with the hand that feeds you.
Jace, Anyhow, how you feeling, man? Because I feel super inspired and like just I still can't believe our, I don't know, call it luck or, you know, whatever it was, to have Doomberg on, to have this kind of conversation, which I thought was, for me, was very insightful. How you feel?
Nah, spectacular. I love the way he talked about building a life with a lot of get tos rather than have tos. That's something that I hope he makes a cup. Hey, Doomy, if you're listening, make a cup. Totally agree. And then on the other side, you know, have a tick get to and no crossing out of have tos. Yeah, and inspired to build a life like he has. And I also appreciate the fact at the end where he said, hey, I know I'm not somebody that's going to be building a company with 1,000 employees or massive numbers of employees, right? And that kind of self-awareness is priceless and inspires me to also reach that kind of self-awareness, right? To know who you are and to do what you're suited for, right? So
Yeah.
very glad that you reached out to him and super glad he said yes.
Amazing. Well, we'll do our best, right, to navigate this world we live in, and hopefully these conversations we have, I mean, they're immensely helpful to me to make sense of it all, and I hope for whoever's listening as well. If there's any like way we can make this more tangible, more practical, more actionable for people, just let us know. I would be very eager to help, right? You know, similar like I was interesting that I struck on that chord with Doomy when he was describing, hey, you should always read the propaganda because it's fascinating and you get to see how they want you to see the issue. And so I was like, well, but it's not super clear to me how you know what's news and what's propaganda. So yeah, maybe we'll write a book on it. That's really crazy, right? So what's the, you know, I don't really want to write a book, but what's the topic that we can elaborate on to help others make the best of all of this falling empires and fiat money decay and multiculturalism, cultural warfare and lawfare and all this like ridiculous stuff that's going on? You know, there was this meme during COVID where people were like, ugh, I'm so sick and tired of living through history. You know, like you really can get that feeling, right? So anything that Jason and I can do, I think, to help, we're more than happy to do, right?
Yeah. So tomorrow we got Deborah Le on, right?
Yes, sir.
Another massive guest. Looking forward to that one.